Here's a guy we don't get to talk to enough. It's our hockey insider, Chris Johnston. We're going to change that. We're going to have CJ on a lot more. And Chris, we're going to get to the Flames and Chris Tanev in just a minute. But let's talk about Elias Pettersson. We just heard from his coach, Rick Tocchet, about how the rumors of Pettersson's contract status might be affecting his play on the ice. What can you tell us about the latest as far as Pettersson is concerned?
Well, this has been a strange one all year long, right, Jay? I mean, in this case, Elias Pettersson hasn't wanted to engage in contract discussions, wanting to put it off to the offseason. Obviously, the Canucks have been a little bit more eager to get there, and there's been a report out there this evening that they've gotten closer to a decision here. And if that is the case, I have to think that the pressure, the human element that Rick Tocchet is talking about plays a role in it. And at this hour, I can tell you there's no confirmation from any of my sources that anything is yet imminent in this position. But, you know, the reason this hasn't taken off earlier in the season wasn't about money. It wasn't about a disagreement in what the player was. It really came back to Elias Pettersson himself, not wanting to discuss a contract during the year, not wanting to deal with the distraction of that. Well, perhaps the fact it's maybe become a distraction in a different way because there's all this speculation about trades and what might happen. There's been a breakthrough here. But, you know, I think all along, the Canucks knew kind of what it was going to cost to keep the player, and Pettersson had a pretty good idea of his market, given that he's been one of the most best offensive players the last few years.
Chris, right now is when we would normally be showing you all the fresh new trade bait boards, but of course, Craig Conroy sort of ruined that for us a couple of hours ago. So we can't do that. That's fine. Let's talk about that deal that saw Chris Tanev go to Dallas. What can you tell us about the deal?
Well, you know, Craig Conroy really wanted a first-round pick in this deal. Ultimately, he settles for a second-rounder as part of this trade. And I think really whether this becomes a trade we look back on as a positive move for the Flames or not will hinge, you know, largely on the prospect they get here from Dallas, because I do know Calgary was quite high on him. But, you know, at this point in time, there's always sort of this risk-reward for general managers. You're a week and a bit out from the deadline itself. You know, would the price have gone up? Would another team have stepped forward and paid more for Chris Tanev had the Flames waited closer to March 8th? I mean, that's sort of an unknowable. You know, what I can tell you is the Stars were very aggressive in their pursuit of Tanev. You know, really like the player. It's an ideal fit for their team. They've been looking for someone that can slot in on the right side of their blue line, and they're a team that feels they have a chance to win a Stanley Cup and feeling much better now that they've made this deal. So, you know, Craig Conroy settles maybe for a little bit less on paper than he was hoping in the trade, but it also does give him time now to move on to some of his other pieces, starting with Noah Hanifin.
Yes, let's talk about Noah Hanifin. Maybe he can make it up on that deal. Hanifin, number one on the trade bait board. But, Chris, how quickly do you think this deal could potentially get done?
You know, it doesn't seem like anything is you know, percolating at this time. I mean, certainly there have been teams expressing interest in Hanifin, and I think, you know, what's to note about his case is, while he is a pending UFA, I think some of those teams trying to work out a deal with Calgary are interested in you know, perhaps exploring an extension with them. And so because of that extra layer of a moving part, it might not happen as quickly because, you know, theoretically the Flames have to get to a spot where they like the trade return, and then there has to be a contract ironed out. But, you know, Hanifin now, you know, there's 9 days for Craig Conroy really to work through this deal, and it's going to be a big one. I mean, he's younger than Chris Tanev. You would think that he will get back at minimum the first rounder plus, although, you know, what's been interesting about this year's trade action is there hasn't been a lot of it. We don't have a lot of comparables out there just yet, and so I still think we're getting, you know, a feel for the exact, you know, basic, you know, spot where the market is at right now. But, you know, when it comes to Hanifin, I've been told there's 4 or 5 teams around there. I've reported previously the Tampa Bay Lightning are among them. I think the Boston Bruins have kicked tires on what would be a hometown boy, and there's a couple others that are looking to make this deal and perhaps sign Hanifin to a longer-term contract.
And, you know, we were talking about the Calgary Flames, and Tyler Toffoli already moved from the Calgary Flames to the New Jersey Devils earlier this season. And now, Chris, Toffoli is making his debut on our trade bait board. Are the Devils finally waving the white flag on the season? And Chris, who is likely to be looking at Tyler Toffoli?
They're not waving it just yet, I would say. But, you know, let's face it, they've slipped back in the wild card race. A lot hasn't gone right in New Jersey with injuries and other situations this season. And I think that they're aware that they have, you know, a player who's already scored 25 goals this season, has scored consistently over his career, and that other teams out there are interested. I think a team like the Edmonton Oilers, for example, would at least have some interest in Tyler Toffoli if he became available. And there's just not a lot of scoring wingers, on this market. I mean, we have Jake Guentzel, probably the best example of that. But for teams that strike out on Guentzel, I think Toffoli would be a pretty good consolation prize if, and I have to keep saying if, New Jersey does make him available. They're currently in California on a 3-game road trip, and I think where they stand after those 3 games will go a long ways to determining what the Devils do here. If they move on from Tyler Toffoli or perhaps keep him. And the strangest part of it all is it wasn't that long ago they were talking about an extension with the player. They really like the player. It's not a case of a bad fit. It's just more about maximizing the asset with perhaps this season fading from view in terms of their ability to make the playoffs.
Let's talk about goaltending, my friend. Barry Trotz, Nashville GM, says the Preds are unlikely to trade UC Saros, despite the emergence of Yaroslav Askarov in the minors. Jake Markstrom has dropped from 2 to 10 on our trade bait board. Things getting a little muddied up in the goaltender market right now, Chris?
What's that old saying? The goalies are voodoo, right? It feels like we got a league where teams are struggling to figure out which goalies are good or who they can rely on, but also who's worth trading for. I mean, it's been an unusual season, to say the least, where a number of top teams, I think, have at least some concern about their goaltending. But we haven't seen trades involving goaltenders. And there's a number of players that have been on the trade bait board. And you're right, as we're getting closer and closer to March 8th, it seems like if you're looking for a trend there, it's just the guys coming off it. UC Saros essentially coming off. Marc-Andre Fleury was on there. He's going to stay in Minnesota beyond the deadline, so he's off. I mean, maybe you got a Jake Allen in Montreal, but even in his case, he signed through next season. And I think in some of the talks that Canadians have had with other teams, there's concern about the fact that he's under contract next year. It might not fit with where teams are aligned longer term. And so, his deal potentially could get pushed to the offseason. I mean, maybe when all is said and done, there's no goaltenders traded, but it hasn't been for lack of availability. Whether at various points it was a Markstrom, a Saros, and Allen, even Capo Kakkonen in San Jose, who's playing behind a very porous team, has put up pretty nice numbers. Yep. He's a pending UFA, and so perhaps he might be the best, most likely goalie to be traded just because he's on an expiring contract. He'll come cheap, and it won't cost a lot to get him.